Today, I'm just going to start off with Greece, architecture between 800 BC and 200 AD. We've seen, we're going to, of course, this is the ancient Acropolis, which we've seen multiple times. We've seen, if not hammered to death, the ancient Parthenon. That's, of course, on top of the early citadel there in Athens. And we're going to be in Rome. This is Rome. Of course, this is modern day Rome, which incorporates first century AD Rome, and of course, Renaissance and Baroque. These are Renaissance and Baroque domes. We're going to be focusing on Roman architecture, roughly the first century, between the time of Nero and then, of course, Hadrian, parts of it Augustus. But for the most part, it's really impossible to condense, the entire city of Rome in about 30 to 40 minutes. I'm just focusing on the early stages, roughly the first century AD. But these are just some really wonderful images of what the culture of Greece and Rome we're going to be looking at in just a few minutes. Of course, here we are in Greece. Last week we were down at the bottom, in the island of Crete. And so we're not too far away from Crete. So we're going to be in Athens, the very end of the tip next to the sea. So Athens, of course, you're associating that with, of course, the Acropolis, which we'll kind of look at some of the buildings. But for the most part, it's Greece. The architecture of Greece is much more than just the Parthenon, the Acropolis. They did amphitheaters, they did Senate buildings. For the most part, we're looking at the Greek culture between art, sculpture, and architecture, between archaic, classical, and Hellenistic Greece, three specific different periods. And of course, you're going to be featuring the Acropolis, which is built during 450 BC. So really between classical and Hellenistic Greece. They're going to be comparing Greek architecture to, of course, Greek and Roman architecture. Compared to Roman architecture, Greek is somewhat static. It's very orthogonal. They're using stone and marble and wood, not concrete. Rome was using concrete. Greek architecture, the stadiums do use the hillside for the stadiums, and the Romans, they built up the stadium on columns. Really, the two principal architects of the Greek societies is Aquinas and Callicrates. Of course, they're the ones responsible for designing and building the famous Parthenon, a very, very sophisticated structure and design, for 450 BC. Of course, the famous, wonderful sculptor Phidias. Obviously, we've seen and analyzed and documented the classical orders, which are, of course, established in Greece: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. We'll look at those a little bit later. But just remember, we've already kind of talked about these classical orders again. For the most part in the lecture, I'm going to be showing you some other buildings in Greece where we really haven't seen, which are very special and extraordinary to see. We've seen, of course, the Parthenon, the Pantheon, and Colosseum, but we're going to see some other hidden gems, which are very pivotal buildings in the world of architecture. I'm going to show you this painting. This is the Renaissance architect Raphael, extraordinary architect, painter. This is, of course, his famous painting called The School of Athens. And of course, this is painted in the Renaissance, roughly the 14 to early 1500s. But this is showing you all the Greek philosophers, architects, mathematicians that were pivotal at really changing the Western world and reintroducing Western philosophy. At the time, we're seeing, let me pause for a minute. There was a fire ambulance. There's an ambulance going on. Hold on just a moment. Okay, so you can see I'm sorry, but I live in a world of architectural buildings, and once you do that, there's always accidents. The elevator doesn't work, there's a fire, but it is wonderful and kind of distracting. But anyway, there are several different analyses of which figures are depicted. Again, I was saying there's mostly mathematicians, philosophers, artists, architects. This is painted in a very Renaissance Renaissance Roman setting because, of course, the Greeks didn't have arches or barrel vaults. But it's interesting that Raphael superimposed all the Greek philosophers because probably in the Renaissance time, they didn't really know what a Grecian setting looked like. So he superimposed the Greek setting in a Roman sort of kind of background. But this is a wonderful depiction about the world of humanities, art, and architecture during the time of the Renaissance. Of course, the Renaissance was a rebirth of the humanistic approach to man as the center of the world. We're looking at humanistic approaches to geometry, philosophy, and of course, theory. This is a fresco painted onto a plaster panel, so it's not an oil paint. Obviously, the Parthenon we've seen 450 BC, but look at the power of this incredible work that was built with really primitive tools and hand chisels. A very incredible sort of journey up to the very top of this temple. But before we look at the Pantheon again in depth, we're going to be looking at three different phases. This is mostly seen clearly in sculpture. We see archaic Greece, classical Greece, and Hellenistic Greece. You can clearly see the very distinct styles. From the archaic is a very simple sort of, I don't want to say the word bland, but a very kind of frozen pose. The classical is a little bit more looser. We can see that the left or the right knee is a little bit more relaxed. The faces are still very bland. There's no description about, there's no passion. It's considered reason over passion at that time. So we get to Hellenistic art and architecture, we can see that there's wings flying out of the composition. We're definitely breaking the mold of these very primitive sort of archaic and very kind of nondescript sort of facial expressions which are not existing. So when we get to Hellenistic sculpture, we see the passion. Of course, we could see the sort of agony and ecstasy in each one of the faces that are carved. This is just extraordinary. It's sort of pretty much an unknown sculptor that's not attributed to anyone's name, but we can definitely see that the life and energy is definitely incorporated in the passion in this sculpture called the Laocoon group, which is of course an unknown sculptor. This is definitely the Hellenistic sculpture, but you can definitely see it's a far cry, a break from the sort of archaic and reason over passion that we're seeing in the earlier sculptors. What's interesting is that the architecture in ancient Greece really didn't change. It was still very, archaic and classical. We're not seeing anything breaking beyond the composition of the actual buildings. It's interesting that the sculpture is a very dynamic force in Grecian architecture and sculpture. Now these are, of course, the Hellenistic the Hellenistic sculpture by the famous Phidias that designed all the sculptures and the friezes on the ancient Parthenon. So we can see that the sculpture really animates a sort of what I'm calling the static architecture. And that's not a derogatory term. I'm just comparing that to the flying arches that we do have in Roman architecture several hundred years later. We can definitely see classical sculpture is breaking away from the archaic. We see a more relaxed pose. We see a very kind of blank sort of stare in classical sculptors. Of course, on the right, you're seeing Michelangelo's David, roughly 1450 BC. We see the same sort of classical sensibility in that the pose is very similar to the classical Grecian pose. So here is the unbelievable citadel, the Acropolis with several different buildings. It's remarkable that, the ancient Greeks with primitive tools, of course, they did have, when I say primitive, I mean they're not using power tools, pneumatic tools, water power tools. Definitely nothing in the Industrial Revolution in America, but we still have these incredible stone-like forms that emerge from this incredible stone plinth. Of course, here is what it looks like now. They're, of course, reconstructing some of the buildings that were damaged over the years of earthquake, dynamite storage, and of course other accidents in the world. We're looking at is the Acropolis is not just one building. The Parthenon is the largest temple on, of course, this what I'm calling the citadel, the main central core of the Senate buildings in the ancient Acropolis in the Athens. Of course, we're seeing the Parthenon dedicated to the temple of the goddess Athena. We're seeing the propylae is, of course, the entry piece, the main entry temple front that you would first experience and before you see the actual temple for the Parthenon. Of course, the Erechtheion is a smaller classical temple, which of course incorporates all the classical orders, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, a small little, strangely enough, asymmetrical temple. Classical architecture is very emphatically symmetrical, but there are several different exceptions to the rule, which we're going to see here. So what we're looking at is some of these diagrams are looking at the plan layout of the top, of course, the Acropolis. A very interesting sort of visibly looking arbitrarily oriented fields of buildings. But if you look at the two diagonal arrows, and can you see my cursor on the screen? Okay, so let's look at the small
I guess you
temple,
can.
Athena, Nike. Of course, this is the main entry pavilion. It's really important to know how you actually enter these spaces. So you would enter the proper layer. You would come through this wonderful long corridor of columns. You would open up outside of the temple. You would see the Parthenon on the oblique. You would see the rear facade, the side facade in one view, and then of course you would navigate through the corners, and you would come to what looks like the back of the temple is actually the very front, which you don't see. So there's a certain element of surprise and a journey from the entry portal up to the actual space inside that houses this extraordinary gold leaf statue dedicated to Athena. And of course, some of the other buildings, we see some of the other smaller temples dedicated to other gods, but for the most part, the largest temple is the most important one. And we're seeing at the bottom of is, of course, the theaters, which are carved and using the hillside as the slope for the stadium seating. Here's, of course, another plan of highlighting the different buildings based on different centuries. We can see what looks like an arbitrarily placed, conglomeration of buildings is a very strategic order in the way that these buildings are placed based on your particular view upon arriving into the site. So we're looking at is, if you look at the plan, some different station points about how you'd experience the temples. This, of course, is the first thing you would see upon arriving to the Acropolis hillside. You would see some of these buildings obliquely, of course, the way they're oriented on the site. A lot of people don't really understand that. It looks like, when I show my students, they think, oh, those corners, those angles are really groovy. I love it. It's really sexy. But of course, it's really based on the way you're perceiving some of these temples upon your particular station point in the site. And here's a plan, of course, of Greek structure in space, 400 BC. We can definitely see that we're using a post and lintel type of construction because, of course, we're using marble and stone and wood in limited uses. They're not able to span that far because they have limited structural span capacity. So when you look at Grecian space and structure, you're looking at mostly a plan of columns. And this is just an extraordinary building, which I've shown you many times in history of the other classes. But for the most part, this is definitely a temple to house gods, not temple for citizen people to live there. We've seen this is the way the Pantheon is actually built with what's called optical refinement. We've talked about this many times. There's really not one straight line in this temple. It visually looks like that, but they're accommodating for the way the eye perceives the columns tapering to the sky, and of course, the way the building is perceived by visibly looking at it, what I've kind of explained early in the class. So what we're looking at is, now this is a surprising reconstruction of the Parthenon. This is actually the reconstruction in Nashville, Tennessee, and everyone kind of laughs at me when I look at this, but this is incredible reconstruction of what it actually looks like exactly. Of course, this is taken out of context. We're not seeing it on the top of the hill with all the other buildings, but we're seeing a sort of pebble, sort of concrete reconstruction. It is built exactly like it was first designed in 450 BC. What we're looking at is the interiors. Of course, the statue, this is exactly what it would look like when it was first built. The statue of Athena would be gold leaf with gold. We're seeing the trabeated system. By trabeation, I mean the layering of the post and lintel construction types, the columns with, of course, the lintels above to, of course, accommodate for the ceiling change in the temple. A really magnificent reconstruction of what the temple used to look like. Of course, the smaller temple, the Erechthon, which you've seen before, has, of course, the caryatids, the anthropomorphic statues. The maidens, of course, are built as archaic sculptures. They're not Hellenistic. We're not seeing any passion. We're seeing reason over passion. Really interesting sort of visual dynamic to show the faces as these very archaic and static sculptures. Of course, these are some very intriguing anthropomorphic column orders we've seen, which kind of breaks the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian order. Of course, as a smaller temple, I like to show architecture in Greece as these really wonderful, poetic black and white photographs. Here's a section, of course, for the Parthenon. It's interesting that, when we think of the Parthenon, it's just kind of a bland temple with kind of a pitched roof. Well, it's definitely, when you look at the section, it has some very interesting section change. There's a small little temple that breaks the temple front The trabeated system is again stacked with these small little carriages, of course, to let natural light into the temple of the sculpture of Athena. This is, of course, in the British Museum, Phidias's incredible sculptures. This is probably the most fluid visual dynamic compared to the static sort of Pantheon temple that we have. These are some of these wonderful, obviously Hellenistic, extraordinary sculptures that are still which are actually in the British Museum, taken from, of course, the frieze on, of course, the Parthenon. These are some other smaller buildings we've seen before. I mentioned that the building originally were apparently supposed to be polychrome. They were embedded with either ink or some sort of fused material. They're not painted on the marble, but of course we've seen that Greek architecture is post and lintel, Roman, of course, is arch construction. Here's, of course, a section showing the post and lintel type of construction. But there's so many other wonderful buildings in Greece besides that we're looking at. They built the Greek stoas, which of course are probably marketplaces for the ancient Greeks. Pay no attention to that sort of Byzantine building on the bottom right. But this is actually a reconstruction of what one of the ancient Greek stoas used to look like. Very emphatic post and lintel. Post and lintel, definitely not arches. This is a wonderful corridor built with marble columns. And of course, we're seeing wooden lintels. Here's kind of an example of kind of a shipbuilder's platform, very primitive, interesting section of the classical orders. Are very unrefined at this point. But for the most part, of course, the ancient Greeks had wonderful philosophers and orators. We're looking at a place to exhibit a particular person's oratory skills. This, of course, is built on the hillside. The ancient Greeks were able to master the art of the acoustics. Of course, this is way before microphones. But we're looking at is if you stand at the center of the circular dial on the floor, pretty much all the spectators will be able to hear one person whisper or speak by the way the hillside is accommodating with the seating. It's really incredible that we're able to use the hillside as a acoustical setting for one person's voice without yelling. We're seeing Roman architecture because Roman architecture does not use the hillside. They're using the colonnade around that to build up for the seating. Of course, this is a Roman theater, not using the hillside. Some other examples, the Theater of Epidaurus. So now we're going to be entering Rome, of course, the ultimate eternal city. We're looking at the Roman Empire was a huge, people think that the city of Rome was a small little dot. Well, of course, you can see the center of what's called the boot. The Roman Empire spread thousands of miles, incorporated what's now England and parts of the other parts of the world. This is just a huge, enormous setting for the Roman Empire. So pretty much all over Western Europe, we're seeing Greek temples and Roman temples, of course, which were places for, of course, Roman Empire. So we're looking at Italy, we're looking at Rome. Of course, you can see the center of Italy is where Rome is. Crete and Sicily is much further down from there. So we're just going to be focusing on the Roman architecture in the 1st century AD. There's tons of really wonderful buildings. But of course, the origins of Rome, of course, is the famous statue of Romulus and Remus. Legend has it that Romulus and Remus were abandoned by the mother and they were saved by the she-wolf that kind of, suckled them back to life. And of course, they became adults and they decided to establish the foundation for the city of Rome. So Romulus and Remus had a big fight about where the city of Rome was going to start. So Romulus killed Remus, and of course, he became the originator of the Roman civilization, of course, called Rome, based from Romulus, a very abbreviated version of the origins. But you can see that Romulus and Remus were found on what's called the Palatine Hill. So pretty much the entire setting for the city of Rome is built on these 7 hills. And of course, Romulus and Remus began on the Palatine Hill. It's the very beginning place for the city of Rome. And what a wonderful place to begin. It's really based around 7 different hills, very different types of buildings. So Roman architecture, I'm not going to read this to you. You can go back and look at the PDF file for the information. But for the most part, we're looking at, Greek society radically changed from Roman society because the world was getting bigger, people were, of course, the world, there was more people now, so buildings became larger, structural dynamics changed, the size and space of architecture, mostly due to the invention of concrete. So now we have public baths, much larger building, the aqueducts, the temples, just incredible 1,000 years of just nothing but progress and, of course, structures. We're looking at are really not houses for citizens, but they are mostly large buildings for the growing public that Rome was able to afford at this time. We're going to be studying architecture based on the principle of Le Corbusier. He was able to kind of narrow down all the principles of architecture are based on very basic spherical and cylindrical forms, based on pure geometry, the cylinder, the square, the rectangle. We can see that the lessons of Rome are based on pure geometric forms. So we're going to talk about the aqueducts later, but let's take a look at the ultimate plan, the Noli map of Rome. This, of course, is what the space of Rome would have looked like in 1748. This, of course, is modern Rome, but the plan of Rome is a series of public space. You can see walking through each one of these spaces, through each one of these buildings that, of course, it looks like the entire city is carved out of a solid block of stone or wood. Of course, the Noli map is 3, 6, 9, 12 different sections. The city, we see the ancient world incorporated into the modern world. And again, we'll be talking about Rome, the Italian Rome, and of course, the modern Roman world later in Renaissance architecture. Of course, the beginning of Rome really begins with the aqueducts and their construction. There's probably 30 different aqueducts. The way that Rome was, of course, founded is the way the lifeline of Rome is based on the water system. The aqueducts, of course, brought water and life to the city based on individual springs. It wasn't really one large reservoir of a body of water. They came from natural springs. But for the city of Rome to function, we had to have fresh water from springs. So the beginning of the Roman structure and architecture, of course, was the aqueducts. You can see the aqueducts sort of thread through the city by these enormous walls. Due to the fact that we're using arch construction, a very more advanced sort of architectural language, far advanced than, of course, the ancient Greeks. So we're mixing post and lintel construction, of course, with Roman arches. Here's a wonderful model that's, of course, still in the EOR system, several miles north of Rome. We're seeing the pure geometric objects that Le Corbusier mentioned. We're looking at different architectural topology. We see the elliptical Colosseum. Of course, we see the Greek temple. Then, of course, we're seeing the Roman curve and the arches, of course, originated by the ancient Romans. So let's take a look at the first use of Roman arches, of course, are the aqueducts. These are just monumental scale. They're not really pieces of architecture. These are the structural ramification to actually bring water from other sources. And this is just extraordinary sort of structural inventions that really changed Roman structure and, of course, specifically space. So Roman concrete, look at that, masonry walls filled with early primitive concrete. So when you see a Roman brick wall, it's, of course, filled with concrete. So Roman concrete is really a mixture of primarily volcanic ash, water, and lime-based cement. And you can go back and, of course, when Rome was sacked by the Visigoths in 400 AD, is that the formula for concrete was lost, so we went back to building with masonry as stone. So what happens is when Romans discovered concrete, we can free up the entire spatial dynamics with a plan free of columns. On the right, we're seeing the ancient Grecian basic temple, which of course does not have a large span because of their structural limitations. But now in ancient Roman structure and space, we see a plan completely free of columns. This is a plan of the ancient Pantheon in the 1st century AD. So of course, we're seeing Greece space and structure is very different than Roman space and structure because, of course, the structural limitations of the span in ancient Greece before we get to Roman architecture. But look what we can do with the arch and concrete. Look at that. That is a very wonderful diagram of how you actually would structurally build it. This is how they would build aqueducts. You can imagine before you would have to have 1 million post and lintel construction to span this far. There's no way you'd be able to build an aqueduct with just a post and lintel structure. So of course, the Roman aqueducts were built, of course, with the arch. I think we're running out of time, but we can see the the differentiation of the spans, of course, lending itself to very large spans, which of course I'm saying radically change Roman architecture in space. the wonderful Piranesi engraving of some of the arches. You know, of course, by this time we're building with the 5 classical orders, Tuscan, Doric, and again, Corinthian. Of course, the Renaissance introduced and reintroduced the composite order we've seen earlier in the class. Before we see, of course, the Pantheon we've seen before, I'm going to show you a very smaller, kind of undescript, lesser known example of dome construction before we see the Pantheon. I'm sorry, the Pantheon in Rome. We're going to be looking at Domus Aurea's, the Emperor Nero's Golden House, the famous dining room, which has sort of been uncovered and buried by years of dirty construction. But this is a very special building that we need to be looking at. Again, I'm kind of have to narrow down some of the lesser known structures that we haven't seen in the class before. So this is, of course, is one of the facades of Nero's Golden Palace, of course, the Domus Aurea. What we're looking at is specifically is the dining room, a little small octagonal structure on the right. Now this predates the ancient Roman, the circular Pantheon about by 100 years. So number 128 is really the structure for the special dining. This is a really complex spatial dynamic using light and of course a dome construction. Here's a plan, but look at the way that the architect uses light. This is a very centralized core that's in the middle of the building, really doesn't have a facade with natural light coming in. So we had a bar light from other sources, but the cross section is really unique in that what we're looking at is not a truly round dome. We're looking at what's called a faceted dome that transitions into a perfectly round top. Now this predates of course, the Pantheon in Rome. What we're looking at is a precursor of the Roman dome we see later designed by Hadrian. We can see as a very, very complex construction of light coming in through the central core of the building. Of course, this is the temple front. What would happen is, this is architecture in 69 BC. The actual dining room floor would rotate. This is a wooden and stone structure that would turn. What would happen is, the floor of the dining room would rotate and actually have the dining room would actually spin around. And then from the ceiling, there would be slaves that would drop little flower petals into the dining room table. This is a really wonderful animated rotating space, a very primitive sort of structure with very sophisticated technology. Of course, the ceiling would be painted with the zodiac symbols, a really sort of wonderfully dynamic space charged by the fact that the floor could spin around. Of course, here's what it looks like now due to pillage and earthquakes, but we still have the light construction that is evident in the current ruin now. This is a very pivotal precursor to which we have the very sophisticated, ancient Pantheon in the 1st century AD, of course, built by Rome's benevolent ruler Hadrian, one of the favorites of all the emperors. Besides all the crazy people, Caligula and Nero were all psychotic beings that were very narcissistic. But of course, they built extraordinary buildings. But Hadrian was so loved by the citizens of Rome that he was able to, of course, build the famous Pantheon, which we've seen in ancient Rome. Of course, this is one of our first concrete domes that we see in Rome, which we've looked at before. Again, this is a comparison of Greek space on the left and Roman architecture on the right. Now, of course, now we're looking at cylindrical spaces in Rome because, of course, we're using arches and concrete. You look at the power of that simple, that 30 wide foot diameter oculus. Now, the coffers, the square recesses in the ceiling are not decorative, they are structural. They reduce the weight of the concrete, that structural reinforcing. And look at that unbelievable bronze door that has rivets visible. It's still in use today. What I like to show my students is, of course, this is the back of what the Pantheon looked like. We can see that, of course, there's a very sophisticated marble classical frieze, probably a mixture of Ionic and Corinthian orders. Of course, after the sack of Rome, people started borrowing marble and taking them off the buildings. But it's interesting that we still have some of these fragments that are still hanging out there. But the nice thing is we can still see the structure visible on the exteriors of the walls of the Pantheon. We can visibly see the structure of the building. Of course, it would be covered. Of course, it was been removed. We just barely get a glimpse of what this would have looked like in 1st century AD. So now we're going to shift into architecture around the Forum. So we're getting larger public buildings that far surpass the scale and the structure of ancient Greece. These are enormous sized buildings. Rome was a huge empire. The city was probably up to 1 million people by the first century AD. So the public building became much larger and larger. We would not be able to do these buildings without the use of artisan concrete. So let me kind of keep going. What's funny, if you look at, the maps of Rome, we have all these wonderful layers of modern Rome superimposed with ancient Rome. This is probably a map probably in the 1900s. We can see the layers of what the original ancient world looked like on top of the sort of modern. I'm considering that modern because modern Rome was really after the Renaissance broke. And of course, we're seeing that horrible typewriter building in the bottom left, the Victorian manual temple we're trying to look at right now, but I'm just focusing on first century AD. So the grain of these plans of these ancient Roman temples is just a wonderful and extraordinary to look at. Of course, there's a very complex layer of geometry mixed with the ancient Grecian temple typology, mixed, of course, with Roman curves and arches. This is, one of the, we would not be able to do these enormous stone vaulting with just post and lintel from the Greeks. So this is a reconstruction of what the ancient forum looked like back in the day in first century AD. This is what it looks like now, of course, with the back of the Capitoline Hill, which of course Michelangelo designed, the front of the Senate building, Capitoline Hill, behind us. Of course, this is what modern Rome looks like now. We just see the Roman Forum as this layer of ruins. These are just some unbelievable, watercolor renderings of what, of course, the Roman Forum used to look like. These, of course, are digital renderings of what the buildings used to look like. And people ask me, how on earth would somebody figure out what the building looked like and how tall it was? Well, if you go back to the formula, which I kind of talked about earlier in the class at the beginning, we can see the formula or the candidate proportion based on which ore that was built in. If you look at, let me get back to this one. You look at the rows of columns here in the forum, you can get the spacing. There's other heights of the fragments of the entablatures that can tell you how tall the buildings used to be by just a few pieces. It's really wonderful that archaeologists can look at some of the fragments and just reconstruct what the entire building looked like based on which classical order it was built in. Really amazing that you can use these tablets that we still have. You can reconstruct the entire building, and these are just extraordinary digital renderings of what the ancient Roman city used to look like in the first century AD. Of course, these are ink drawings showing you what the buildings used to look like. We need to move on because I think I'm running out of time. This is what the Basilica of Maxentius used to look, well, of course, looks like now. The size of the buildings are just unbelievable. So we're going to be looking at the last section of class. It's about 12:40, and I think I might be going too fast, but you have the luxury of it being recorded. You can go back and look at these and probably slow it down. But some of the most wonderful structure we haven't really seen in the classes are the ancient baths of Rome, based on which emperor. We're going to be looking at really three different ones: Titus, Diocletian, and Caracalla. There's multiple baths. Now, the ancient baths of Rome were public bathing facility. This was the social gathering place that citizens at sort of any rank in society would actually interact with each other and have multiple, there were definitely different rooms. It was a social gathering place. There were libraries. It wasn't just a place to take a shower, of course, but these were the social gathering places, the citizens of any sort of social class in Rome. We're first going to be looking at the size of these buildings. It's interesting to look at, we have, definitely a more sophisticated variation on the Greek temple. We see multiple complex configuration of styles, different outdoor spaces, the layering of course, the colonnades. Now, the size of this is probably 2 or 3 football fields in plan. These are just gigantic buildings. Of course, the Latin terms for frigidarium, peristyle, tabernae, based on different temperatures. We see the cold, the hot baths, the collidarium, so on and so forth. Let's take a look at the scale. This is a football field, roughly, I'm going to guess, 120 meters, 360 feet. If you look carefully at my cursor, let's look at 360 feet, our scale up there. This is just a small part. These are huge buildings. This building alone is larger than 1 football field. Here's AT&T Stadium in Arlington. The baths were larger than this. If you go out there in person, these are just mind-boggling spatial. Of course, we don't see a large, tensile frame structure in ancient Rome, but the size of these are just enormous. Here is the context of the ancient baths of Diocletian, and of course the modern city. We see the scale of the Termini station just right across that. So these are just absolutely enormous scalability. There must have been tens of thousands of people, slaves and citizens, working on this every day, pretty much all day, to build structures like this. So we get a glimpse of what the buildings used to look like these are reconstruction drawings. We're looking at is parts of the remnants of the ancient baths are still there. Of course, most of them are seen as ruins. This, of course, is where Michelangelo remodeled the interior of the ancient baths. Here's a wonderful view. You can see the scale, look how small the people are. These are just, unbelievably large. We're still looking at the construction of the burial vault, the groin vault, and of course, bricks filled with concrete. The main structure is concrete to make this size as possible. There's a wonderful engraving, probably done by Piranesi. I'm just assuming that. But we're looking at is an enormous field and nothing but different sizes of football fields superimposed into this field. So when we look at the ancient baths of Diocletian, there's very different motifs going on, particularly what's called the Diocletian window from, of course, the ancient Diocletian baths, which is borrowed from ancient Renaissance architecture by Palladio. The Diocletian window is a tripartite system, 3 different sections to make way for one window opening. And it's really hard to imagine the scale of these without the people in front. So of course, this is what Michelangelo did. He, pretty much remodeled this, of course, Santa Maria degli, of course, of the angels in the Renaissance. This is probably his later work in the 1560s, but we can see that Michelangelo reconstructed what the original language of the interior of the Baths of Diocletian used to look like in ancient Rome as a Renaissance modern architect. And when you go there, the scale is just unbelievable. We're seeing the very careful application of the composite order in the sanctuary. The Bath of Trajan, another really wonderfully complex mixture of the Greek temple front, of course, with Roman curves and arches. Here's a reconstruction of one of the exedras. Of course, the exedra is a large semicircular curve, a convex curve from an outdoor space or an indoor space. So let's look at the Baths of Caracalla, even more sophisticated in terms of its geometry and its scale. What's interesting, if you look at number 14, there's a large public exedra, of course, a very interesting semicircular bay that combines with some of the earlier curves, of course, in plane. It's the same sort of layout, some of the early baths, but this is one of its largest, more complex system of geometries. But let's look at the cross section. Wow, that is one hell of a building. Look at the thickness of the dome. This is probably 4 or 5 times as large as the Pantheon, but notice how the wall thickness of the domes have to be thicker because the tremendous weight of the concrete bearing on, of course, the walls below this. We can still see that is, of course, it is the groin vault system with the Corinthian or the composite order, because the Corinthian and composite order is the most largest and elaborate order, which of course is very befitting for the size of these ancient baths. Here's another cross section. Here's the Baths of Agrippa next to the ancient Pantheon. You can see that it used to conjoin with some other buildings around the site. Look at what we're capable of doing in the 1st century with masonry and concrete. You would definitely not see a building like this in ancient Greece. I have about another 15 minutes. I'm just going to show you, these are just some examples of what you do when, the ancient Romans were very sustainable. They actually incorporated some of the existing ancient fragments into what's called Renaissance or Baroque Rome. We're seeing the Renaissance section that's kind of remodeled into the Portico of Octavia. The same thing with the Theater of Marcellus. We're seeing that Rome uses its earlier ancient buildings and repurposes them as other different building typologies. I'm going to share with you, there's one YouTube video, hopefully I have it in my lecture. I was going to end the lecture with this wonderful video, which shows a complete reconstruction of the ancient 1st century AD, if I can find that. Yeah, let me change the screen and upload this. We have about, this should be about 8 minutes long, but definitely worth seeing. And let's see. Can you guys still see what's on my screen?
Yes, I see the PowerPoint currently.
Okay, hold on just a minute. Okay, let me pause that for a minute. This is a really wonderful video. Let me see. Can you see the YouTube video?
Okay. Not yet. It's still on. Oh, it's loading now, I think, actually.
Let me upload. Now you're gonna have to bear with me. There are some ads in here, but I couldn't get. But this is very important for you to watch. It's only 8 minutes, but it's very telling about the history and this incredible digital model that these people actually recreated the city around. So this is really important to watch. So can you guys see this? Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Introducing Flex Power Tools for power on the runtime. Faster charging.
Precious metals. At the foot of the hill, there's the tabularium, which is a huge building where mail and public letters are kept.
Can we see this?
Yes.
Let me go back. I'm sorry, they missed the original. Okay, here we go.
The Tiber River, 20,000 steps away from the sea. The river easily crosses this place, and its nearby hills can easily be walled. The ancient Roman wall used to embrace 7 hills. Rome was founded in the year 753 before Christ. On the Capitoline Hill, the most sacred of them all, there are many sacred buildings, of which the most famous is the Temple of Jupiter. The north-facing part of the hill that is firmly walled is called the Arx. On top of the Arx, the Temple of Juno Moneta is situated, where coins are made out of precious metals. At the foot of the hill, there's the tabularium, which is a huge building where mail and public letters are kept. Under the Capitoline and Palatine hills is the Roman Forum. In that valley, there was once a big lake that was dried up after the water was diverted to the river through an underground sewer called Cloaca Maxima. A large number of people came every day to the Roman Forum. It was the most busy and crowded place in the city, surrounded by many public and sacred buildings. This is the Basilica Aemilia, which together with the Basilica Julia is the largest public building in the Forum. The basilicas used to occupy a better place in the fora of the Roman cities. In ancient times, the basilica was a public building where many businesses and courts of law were conducted. Later, Christians took advantage of the basilical form to use it as a religious site for the celebration of liturgy. Centuries later, when the empire became officially Christian, the term was also used to refer to large or important churches. In this sense, the denomination is used today both from an architectural and a religious point of view. Next to the Basilica Aemilia, in the part of the Forum called Comitium, the Curia is located. The Curia is the building where the Roman Senate meets. The Senate consists of 600 senators, very noble citizens who before Caesar's time had the highest power in the Roman Republic. Before the Comitium, there is a high place where orators spoke to people. The name of this place is Rostra, because seawalls of captured ships were adorned at the front. Rostra in Latin is the plural of rostrum, that is the iron part that protrudes from the bow of the ships, and that was used to attack enemy ships. Many illustrious orators, such as Cicero, ascended to the rostra to give a speech to the people. Of the Roman temples, the smallest was certainly the Temple of Janus. He was also the oldest one. This temple has 2 doors that are always open, and are only closed when throughout the whole empire the land and the sea are at peace. These doors were only closed twice from the age of Romulus until the Augustus regime. Augustus closed it for the 3rd time in 700 years after he defeated Marcus Antonius in the Battle of Actium. In the other side of the forum is the Temple of Vesta, which had a ram's shape. Vesta is the goddess of fire and of home, in whose temple an eternal fire burns.
Now remember this.
6 Vestal virgins, daughters of illustrious Romans, were chosen to make sure that the fire was never extinguished, for the fire always burning meant Rome, eternal city. Next to the Temple of Vesta is the Regia, house of the Maximum Pontiff, house where the Roman kings once lived. The Maximum Pontiff is the prefect of all other Roman priests. The job of the Roman priests was to sacrifice animals to the gods and take care of the divine things. In front of the Regia is a temple dedicated to Gaius Julius Caesar, which is called the Temple of the Divine Julius. Caesar, like some Roman emperors, was turned into a god after his death, and he was called divine. The Temple of the Divine Julius was built by his nephew Augustus, in the same place where his body was cremated by the mourning citizens.
CNC plasma systems from the CNC
Sorry
shop
about that. Hold on a
SAS
minute.
are products you can trust.
On either side of the Basilica Julia, there is a large temple. To the right, under the Capitoline, the Temple of Saturn, and to the left, the Temple of Castor and Pollux. The Temple of Saturn is a treasury, the place where public money is preserved. This ancient temple was destroyed in a fire and rebuilt. The Temple of Castor and Pollux is dedicated to the gods Castor and Pollux, twin sons of Jupiter whom the Romans asked for help in battles. Between this temple and the Temple of the Divine Julius, the Senate and the people of Rome built a marble arch to the victorious Augustus after the Battle of Actium. In front of the tabularium are the temples of Concord and of the Divine Vespasian. The Temple of Concord was built after a long discord between 2 enemy factions into which the Roman people had been divided, the patricians and the plebeians. The temple was built when Concord between all the citizens was finally restored. Near this temple is the jail, whose dark, stinking underground part is called Tullianus. The Arch of Septimius Severus, at the northwest of the Forum, was built to commemorate the victories of Emperor Septimius Severus and his 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta, in the 2 campaigns against the Parthians. The Miliarum Marium was a monument erected by the Emperor Caesar Augustus near the Temple of Saturn. All roads throughout the empire were considered to begin at this monument, and all distances in the empire were measured relative to it. The Temple of the Divine Vespasian was constructed by his sons, Titus and Domitian, after the death of their father. Right next to this temple are the porticos of the 12 gods and goddesses, where a golden statue of each god is found inside each portico. Now you might be wondering, how can we possibly know that a place like this used to look like that? There's already foundations left and maybe a few columns. These remains help us identify the scale and the size of the buildings. Additionally, there's a handful of buildings that have stood the test of time, as well as images of the buildings printed in ancient coins. But the most important thing are the books written by Vitruvius. In Rome, there's a lot of public buildings. Today, we explore the ones that surrounded the most important part of the city. If you wish to watch second parts of this video where we explore different typologies of buildings, such as these, then like this video and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you and goodbye.
Okay, well, that was just extraordinary, was it not? Did you get the sense that you were like, you could just jump into the computer screen and walk through those spaces? So, Michelle, are you still there?
Sorry, I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted you to see that because that's the first time I've seen the entire city of Rome just reconstructed in a video fly through. That was just remarkable.
Mm.
Well, we have about 3 or 4 more minutes. I crammed in way too much information in a short period of hour, but that 1 hour of your life was, I'm sure, pretty revealing about the nature of Greek and Roman architecture. Does anyone have any questions or?
Feel free to unmute yourselves if you do have a question or type it in the chat either way.
I think I've lost, hold on. Michelle, I think I've lost my PowerPoint.
Yeah, it's a blank screen right now.
Okay, hold on just a second. Okay, here we go. Yeah, can you see the screen?
Not yet, but it might just be taking a second to load.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, yeah. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah, that was quite a bit. That was a lot to take in, I'm sure.
I don't see anything in the chat yet, but I will let you know if something pops
Okay.
up.
Hey Jay, this is Hill Swift. Hill Swift. That's awesome images and awesome video. Thank you.
Yeah, that video is just unbelievable. The fact that somebody spent the time and reconstruct, they would probably have to start drawing them as a line drawing first and then project. But that's really the wonderful way you can actually, because I was watching, I just wanted to jump in the computer and walk through those spaces. That was amazing. Yeah.
No, it was helpful to see it all as a built form.
Oh, good. Yeah. And again, this is just this is a very brief overview of the power of Greek and Roman architecture, but you could spend years and not. I just try to narrow down the most essential parts of both civilizations.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank
you very much.
You're welcome. I was going to say, that's one of the most, because there's so many videos of Roman and Greek architecture and people misquote things and don't get their terminology right. But that was one of the better videos that I thought was important to experience the city of Rome. Yeah. And I'm sure you guys have probably seen Minecraft, or you have kids that use the Oculus. And I love the Oculus to go through and kind of just walk through what Rome could really look like. It's really fascinating now. Mm-hmm.
There's a question in the chat that says, was there an artist or sculptor who influenced the change from the archaic to classical approach?
Oh, that is a good question. You know what? The thing about back then, I mean, there really wasn't a term called artists and architects back then. They would just be considered painters and craftsmen. So they probably wouldn't have a name. I mean, we only have really two name people. Phidias. Can you guys see the sculptors on my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yeah, Phidias was one of the few named sculptors, and it was Actinus and Callicrates. But other than that, we really don't have a catalog of names of people that did this. But yeah, that's a good question. I don't think there's a name, but you have to kind of wonder, who's the person, or was it the whole society that decided, let's take those sort of static, archaic poses and sort of loosen it up a little. I don't think it was one artist. I think it was a group of collective art, excuse me, I shouldn't say artisans, but craftsmen that kind of emerged.
I think, let me jump in. That's the whole thing about being a tradition, having a traditional approach, is that one craftsman taught his helpers or his students,
Right.
or if you look from the student's point of view, they had a mentor and they learned the craft, and then they got to where they were doing their thing, and
Right.
it just kind of changed over time with a craftsman teaching his apprentice, and the apprentice becoming the craftsman, and so on over hundreds of years.
You're right. I was going to make the analogy that, when you look at, Michelangelo's sculptures, and then you look at Bernini's sculptures,
Exactly.
there wouldn't be a Bernini without Michelangelo. I mean, because Bernini sort of took Michelangelo's language and took acid and made those sculptures flying out of the composition. So they're all kind of, each phase of style is building on the one before that. Yeah.
And they didn't have historians that were trying to put everything in a box. They were just kind of doing their thing.
Yeah, they certainly didn't. It's interesting, the language of clothing, because you can see the archaic sculpture is completely naked. But then, and I'm sure back then, the classical sculpture would have been considered more radical because her right knee is relaxed. And then even more radical, the Hellenistic is this winged victory that's flying out of the pedestal. But yeah, that is a good question. I don't think it was one person that just, but Hill, I think you're right about the segue into the different styles there. Well, I was going to say, we just hit it on a very small little section of the history of Rome. We just looked at, first century Rome up until, I didn't even mention the fall of the Roman Empire, but, throughout the rest of the other courses, when we talk about Renaissance, neoclassical, we're going to be visiting Rome. We're going to be visiting Italian and Renaissance Rome, as well as Baroque Rome later. This is just a small little taste, because there's no way we can talk about all the phases in 30 minutes. But this should give you a really good foundation of the origins, how these things sort of evolved from the ancient Greek temple to the fact that the material concrete changed everything. It's like, the creation of steel after the Victorian era. Look what the buildings we have now. Okay, well, are there any other questions?
No other questions in the chat unless anybody would like to unmute and ask another question out loud.
Yeah, it's just, I think it's right at 1. I just want you to remember this section and this early dome, Domus Aurea. This is really a precursor to the Pantheon, which people really don't. It's hard to go visit that because most of it is in ruin. And can you guys? It looks like this now. Can you see the image?
Yes.
It's just hard to believe. And of course, we can see in reconstruction drawing that this one narcissistic, crazy, psychotic dictator had these incredible rooms in his palace. And the fact that they were able to figure out how to make the floor turn without electricity or oil. And I just find that really fascinating. Well, I don't mean oil, I mean, gas powered and steam engines. There was definitely nothing like that back then.
That they also filled the Colosseum with water to have naval battles. They were quite ingenious.
Yeah, I was gonna show that building, but we've seen it before. But yeah, they would flood that floor, and the aqueducts would supply, water into that. So yeah, I mean that was pretty extraordinary. Yeah. Well, I just thought that having a football field the size of these things is really hard to even imagine. Because the stadium is huge, and then that's not even the full size of these ancient baths. I mean, this is a large section of a pretty big part of Rome. Okay, well, I guess, Michelle, I guess I'm finished with the lecture, and then this will be recorded and edited, right? And you'll be able to watch this later after it's been compressed.
Yes, yes, we'll have it up pretty soon on the website. If anybody wants to go back to look at it a little more slowly.
Okay. Okay, well, everyone, thanks for attending. I'll see you next Tuesday, and I'm not sure, I think we'll be in Renaissance Rome next Tuesday. So I'll see you then.
Great, thanks so much.
Okay, thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.